Committee on Lectures, and I'm glad you decided to show up for our lecture this evening, sponsored by the Committee on Lectures and the Iowa Public Interest Research Group. I'd like to encourage people to come down towards the front. Steve will try to speak without a microphone, so it might be easier to hear him down here in this small group. We're very privileged to have Steve Whitman as our speaker tonight. Steve's a lecturer at Northwestern University's Urban Policy and Research, something like that. It's close enough. It's a Policy Research Center in Northwestern. But he's also a longtime activist in prison and criminal justice areas, starting in Alabama and presently now in the Illinois area. And he's one of the co-founders of the efforts to stop the lockdown at Marion Prison. We are pleased to have him tonight, and I'd like to have everybody join me in a round of applause for Steve.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. You can all hear me okay, can you? Okay. What I would like to do today is, the title implies, I don't know if you've all seen the title, but the title is The True Purpose of the Criminal Justice System. And I've asked my friends here, and they've complied, to put the word criminal justice and system all in separate quotation marks, meaning to me, and I hope by the end of our discussion here today to you, that those words aren't really applicable to the concepts we'll be discussing. What I think is that we all know that there's lots going on around prisons. They're in the newspapers all the time. And I think my underlying idea in all of this is that we're involved in not only the physical reality, which we'll talk a lot about, but I think in some ways we're caught in an ideological stopping point, and we can't quite see our way out of what to do about the prison system. So what I want to do this evening is show you a lot of facts and evidence that I've been gathering, the group I work with called the Committee to End the Marion Lockdown has been gathering, and then try to raise some of the ideological issues with you. Marion Prison, just by way of mentioning, is a federal prison located in southern Illinois. Its official name is the United States Penitentiary at Marion. It's about 6 hours south of Chicago. And I have some literature from our committee that's up here, and you might want to come by afterwards and take some of it. It's all free. And I also have some notes on some of the data I'll be showing you about the prison system is also duplicated in case you want to take any of those facts with you. Marion is generally regarded, I think, as the worst prison in the United States. It replaced Alcatraz prison in 1963 as the end of the road. And since then it has been evolving and getting worse and worse. So I have some literature on that. And the format that we've agreed to, and I hope that you'll join us for as much of this as you have the energy for, is I'll make my presentation, and then we can have a discussion for as long as you want afterwards. And then I have two rather brief videos about Marion Prison, which I understand can be shown comfortably in this room. And for those of you who want to hang around, we're going to be looking at them afterwards and then talk about Marion in specific. That would be great. I hope as many of you as possible will stay, and I think you'll find the videos interesting as well. Some of you may know, can anyone tell me, this is 1990, some of you have probably noticed that. What's the relationship between 1990 and the prison system? Does anybody know? It's a special date. Well, it actually marks, you put your hands down now. It marks the 200th anniversary of the penitentiary. And it's especially noteworthy, I think, because in 1790, the penitentiary was conceived and implemented initially by the Quakers. And it was conceived and initiated in response to their perceptions that up until then, people who were allegedly criminals and caught were, physically punished, beaten, and endured other kinds of corporal brutality. And the Quakers said, this doesn't make any sense. It's counterproductive. It doesn't bring anything to society, and it really doesn't help the individuals that much. We have an idea, they said. Let's take these individuals, we'll put them in a room, which became a cell, and we'll give them a Bible. And they'll study, they'll be introspective, they'll examine their situation, and they'll do penitence. Penance, I guess, is the word. And it's from that word penance that the word penitentiary comes. And so this is the 200th anniversary of the penitentiary. And the Quakers and the American Friends Service Committee recognize now that they made a big mistake in those days, and they're trying as hard as they can to undo some of the evils that have been done by the penitentiary, and they're having a series of events all around the country this year to try to address some of those problems. But prisons, it seems to me, in this day and age are always important to talk about, and I can't think of a period during which it's more important than this year, the 200th commemoration. I'm going to try to show you a lot of facts and information. I think it'll be easily assimilable. To the extent that some of it slips by you, it's no big deal. Let's see, I put on the projector? I think the light switch puts on the projector. Audio project. It says projector controls and projection booth.
Right.
Oh, but do I do some? But that's a light. Let's see.
Steve's up there.
Okay.
Sorry for our technical difficulties here.
Yeah, I'm pressing this and nothing's happening. How is it so far? Orange? No.
Still out of focus?
Yeah. Also, this. All right. Well, we can try. This is. I just wanted to start by giving you some facts about the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system has an annual budget of $25 billion a year. Prisons and jails account for over half of that. I can't get that to work. Could you? You did. See, I think no matter what you do, it keeps going forward. Okay, so criminal justice is a $25 billion a year industry. It's quite enormous. Prisons and jails are over half of that budget, $13 billion. Per capita spending on jails and prisons has increased to over 200% in the last 10 years. The crime rate has increased only 7% over the last 10 years. The imprisonment rate has increased 100% over the last 10 years. And a recent estimate I saw said that it costs more than $1 million to imprison one person for 30 years. Now, these figures don't just exist in isolation, but impact on the way we live our lives. I have this quote, which I'd like to read to you. Almost every city and town in Connecticut is facing program cuts in schools due to state grant cutbacks. At the same time, the state plans to spend more than $400 million over the next few years for new prison beds. The University of California is similarly strapped for cash and plans to raise tuition by 10%. 2 years ago, the California Department of Corrections had a cost overrun of $25 million. That same year, the University of California was asked to absorb a $25 million cut in its budget. So the way we spend on the criminal justice system clearly impacts on the way we spend the rest of our budget and how we live our lives. The United States criminal justice system, the prison system, the control system within it is also enormous. For example, as we stand here talking this evening, over 3 million adults are under correctional supervision. That includes categories like prisons, jails, probation, parole, and so on. Over 3 million. 3 million is the size of the city of Chicago, where I live, or the size of Nicaragua, the country. That's how much 3 million is. About 8 million people are arrested each year in the United States. And actually, I think that figure is low. It's just gotten higher. And I believe 8 million is more than, for example, in any Central American country, that live in any Central American country. And about 85,000 juveniles are in facilities right now as we speak in the United States. So as you can see, the correctional control aspect of the criminal justice system is really enormous. As of, that should be December 31st, at the end of 1989, there were over 700,000 people in prisons. Now, for the rest of the presentation, I want to talk to you just about prisons. Do you know that, so I won't be talking about jails, probation, parole, or any of those other categories in general. Do you know the difference between a prison and a jail? No? A jail is used either for people who have not yet been convicted and who can't afford to get out on bail, or for people who have been convicted of short terms and sent in on short-term sentences like 6 months or so. So in the United States, most counties have jails, and many cities have jails, and states run, each state has a prison system, and the federal government has a prison system. And it's only the prison system that I'll be speaking about to you today. So if we talk about jails and probation and parole, that would increase the numbers a lot, but I only want to talk about prisons today. The United States is adding about 1,000 prisoners per week, or 52,000 per year. To understand how quickly this system is expanding, I just note that Illinois, again the state that I live in, has 25,000 prisoners. So every year we're adding twice as many prisoners to the system as is contained by the state of Illinois. About 7% of all prisoners are federal prisoners, and about 5% are women.
The spotlights will help.
Excuse me?
Turn off the spotlights.
Well, I'm going to be reading a little bit. Can you see the slides? Are they okay this way?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, thanks. One good way to measure imprisonment, there are many different ways, but one way that's often used is in the imprisonment rates per 100,000 population. So for example, this slide says that in 1930, the imprisonment rate was 104. That means that for every 100,000 people living in the United States that year, in 1930, 104 of them were in prison. And as you can see, that rate stayed more or less constant until 1970. You know, it varied about 100, a little more, a little less, but stayed about constant. And then in 1970, it really started zooming upwards until 1989, when the imprisonment rate was 272. So from 1970 to 1989, the rate had tripled. As you can see, the proportion of black people in prison has also increased enormously, from 23% in 1930 to 47% in 1986. And data on Spanish-speaking people is harder to find, but it was 2% in 1960 and 13% in 1986. Does anybody know what proportion of the population black people are in the United States?
11?
Okay, someone said 11. I think it's actually closer to 13, but it's certainly in that ballpark. It gives you some sense of what the 47 means. These are imprisonment rates divided by race. In other words, the slide I just showed you that in 1989, the imprisonment rate for the United States as a whole, I believe, was 279 per 100,000. And here's what happens when you break it down by race. It's 1,101 for black people, 391 for Hispanic people, and 149 for white people. So, for example, a black person is about 7.5 times more likely to go to prison in the United States than a white person. Hispanic person 2.5 times as likely as a white person. Those figures, of course, vary a lot from state to state. Again, I live in Illinois, so I have this slide. And as you can see, the proportion of the population that's black in Illinois is 59%, Hispanic is 9%, and the racial composition of Illinois is about the same as for the United States as a whole. So you can compare that with the population figures. As I said, in the United States as a whole, a black person is 7.5 times more likely to go to prison than a white person. In Illinois, it's 10 times more likely. In New York, it's 12 times more likely. Of course, in other states, it's less likely, but there's variation in the numbers, and some get even higher than the 7.5%. That's the US average. This slide, I think, provides great insight into what's happening with the prison system. The top half of the slide shows imprisonment rates for Western Europe. These data are taken from the United Nations in 1980. I obtained more recent data, and they all look the same. That is, the figures change a little bit, but the comparisons all remain identical. And as you can see, the rates for Western Europe range from a low in the Netherlands of 17 to a high in Finland of 94. And the group maybe, I don't know, if you took the average, you'd get something like maybe 60 or 70. If you look down below, you can see that the imprisonment rate for white people in the United States is 90. Very similar to the rate for other Europeans. If you look furthermore at the bottom of the slide, you see that in 1980, the imprisonment rate for black people in South Africa was 361, and the imprisonment rate for black people in the United States was 567. This means that in 1980, a black person in the United States was almost twice as likely to go to prison as a black person living in South Africa. And I've told you, although these data from 1980, more recent data tell exactly the same story. To me, this is an absolute staggering observation. And when I first came across these data and showed it to some of my friends, they wouldn't believe it, and I had to go and bring them the books to demonstrate that this was in fact the case. In 1985, the United States government, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, conducted an extraordinary survey. It had never been done before. And it tried to determine what the probability of lifetime imprisonment was. And what they found was, using data from 1979, was that the probability of lifetime imprisonment for black men was 18.7%, 3.3% for white men, 1.5% for black women, and 0.2% for white women. Now, the 18.7% is almost 20%, which is 1 out of every 5. And that was in 1979, when the rates were much, much lower than they are now. So the rates now, I've calculated them, and in fact, the rates are very close to 1 in 4. That means 1 out of every 4 black men in the United States will go to prison in his lifetime. And remember, please, we're not talking about any of the other criminal justice categories. Not talking about jail, probation, parole, not talking about arrest. 1 out of every 4 black men in his lifetime will go to prison. You can think with me, if you will, what a staggering observation this is. What kind of devastation, what kind of havoc this would bring about black communities throughout the United States. It's not only that these men get taken away and that their roles have to be filled in society, but the costs of supporting the men while they're in prison are enormous. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this situation, but prisoners get virtually nothing. And so people who love them and support them have to send them all kinds of things: toothpaste, soap, clothing, books, cigarettes. When they go visit them, most prisons are far away from urban areas, and the costs of those trips are really extraordinary. So I think when you put all of this together, what we find is that an entire system is being devastated. Another study just took place last year, and one example of the devastation, how it manifests itself in and day out life, was revealed in one small way by the study that found that there are more black men aged 20 to 29 under control of the criminal justice system than there are black men of all ages in college. And again, there are lots of different twists and turns of this number, of the quantity of black people in prison, and that's just one of the facts, one of the statistics that one can examine the devastation firsthand with. Now, what we've seen so far is that the criminal justice system is enormous, it's incredibly expensive, and it's filled with black people. It seems quite reasonable that we should ask ourselves, what is it that the criminal justice system does? And why does an institution like this exist in society? And I'd like to try to address that for now, that question. As far as I can gather, there are lots of little explanations for prisons, but when you group them, you wind up with three large explanations, three official explanations. One is that they rehabilitate, another is that they prevent crime, and a third is that they punish. Let me just take them one at a time. Insofar as rehabilitation goes, I think virtually everyone has stopped saying that prisons rehabilitate. As you may know, people talk about the recidivism rate, the rate at which people return to prison, and that's about 50%. Certain studies are a little bit more, certain studies are a little bit less, but generally I think 50% is a good approximate of the recidivism rate in the United States. Now, imagine what it would be like, say, if an automobile manufacturer had 50% of its cars fail, or if slide projectors failed 50% of the time, or, pots and pans that you use, or half of all the textbooks that you bought, were missing half the pages so you couldn't understand them. Well, all of those systems, of course, would go out of business immediately. The United States prison system has not gone out of business, of course, and continues to grow each day. The 50% recidivism rate, however, is not an indicator of its true failure, because saying that 50% of the prisoners go back and 50% don't go back doesn't mean that the 50% who don't go back have been rehabilitated. It just means, in one way or another, they don't get back to prison. It certainly doesn't mean that their lives have been restructured and that they're now full members of our community. So it's clear, I think, that prisons don't rehabilitate. Let's look at the punishing aspect of prisons. I think just as it's clear prisons don't rehabilitate, it is clear that prisons do punish. No one could doubt that, I don't think. But an open question is that what we want? And we can ask that in two different ways. Remember, I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that the Quakers had invented the penitentiary because they thought that punishment was counterproductive. Usually the theory is, I guess, that we can punish people if it brings about some desired result. But as far as anyone can determine, the punishment that takes place in prison does not bring about any desired result. In fact, virtually everybody is unanimous in agreeing that it's counterproductive. Not only is it counterproductive, but also we're spending $25 billion a year to do it. And so one also then has to take a step back and believe, I think, that punishment can't be the true reason of the criminal justice system. It just doesn't work. It's not rational that way. I think what we're left then with is the fact that most people seem to believe, and I think this is some experts as well as lay people, that we have prisons because they prevent crime. I've just finished writing a chapter on this topic and doing a lot of research. And it may seem hard for you to believe, but there is absolutely no credible evidence that prisons in any way deter crime. And I have here just a few quotations that I'd like to read for you. And as you'll see, they're from diverse sources, and I hope will convince you that this assertion of mine is accurate. One researcher says the results reported in the previous section provide no reliable evidence that risk of imprisonment or time served has a measurable impact on the crime rate. Here's another quote. Incapacitation appears to have been only slightly more effective in averting crimes in the early 80s than in the 70s, despite a near doubling of the U.S. prison populations in less than 10 years. Here's another quote. Despite the intensity of the research effort, this is by the major government panel in the last 20 years that's investigated this question, despite the intensity of the research effort, the empirical evidence is still not sufficient for providing a rigorous confirmation of the existence of a deterrent effect of prisons. Another quote. California and Massachusetts, for example, must increase their prison populations by over 150% and 300% respectively in order to achieve a 10% reduction in crime. Here's a quote, and this one is from the director of the corrections of the state of Alabama, not a well-known bleeding heart liberal. He says, we're on a train that has to be turned around. It doesn't make any sense to pump millions and millions into corrections and have no effect on the crime rate. And finally, this is from the Correctional Association of New York. The prison population in New York State has more than doubled since 1971. The state's new policies have been staggeringly expensive, have threatened a crisis of safety and manageability in the prison system, and have failed to reduce the crime rate or even stop its increase. After almost 10 years of getting tough, the citizens of New York are more likely to be victims of crime today than in 1971. Moreover, the largest rise in crime came at the end of the decade, well after the introduction of more severe sentencing practices. Now, a long time ago, or 20 years ago actually, William Nagel was an ex-warden, and he recognized then the failure of the penitentiaries. And so he resigned, and ever since then he spent his time going around the country trying to lecture against prisons. And he has this quote. He says, "The causes of crime in this country are deeply rooted in its culture and in its economic and social injustices. The massive use of incarceration has not contributed significantly to the abatement of crime or to the correction of the flaws in our social fabric." What Nagel is saying, I think, just saying it a slightly different way, is most people seem to believe, or at least a lot of us, that crime results from unequal social conditions. And so what you have is you have unequal social conditions over there, and crime stemming from that, and you have prisons over here. And Nagel is saying, how in the world can you think that this institution will impact on that relationship? And indeed, as study after study after study has demonstrated, it doesn't. Now, Nagel wrote this in 1975, but it turns out that this has been a well-known phenomenon for a long time. Michel Foucault wrote an interesting book, a French, philosopher, historian, anthropologist or something. He died just a short while ago. He wrote a book called Discipline and Punish about the prison system. And he says the answer of criticisms of the penitentiary has always been the same, that we need more penitentiaries. For 2 centuries, the prison has always been offered as its own remedy, as the only means of overcoming its own failure. Now, I told you before that I work with this group called the Committee to End the Marion Lockdown. We're experiencing that right now. Marion, as I mentioned, was opened in 1963. It's become worse and worse as the years have progressed. And every time the Bureau of Prisons makes the prison worse, they say to the Congress and to the public, let us make it worse, and then things will get better in society. The rest of the prison system will be safer, society will be safer, and so on. Well, of course, that's never happened. And so now it's almost 30 years since Marion has opened. Let us just announced plans to do that in the phenomenon of repeating these failures over and over again has continued for the last 200 years. My committee and people consider this week. Elliot Cary, I think, is the most readable book on the issues of crime and imprisonment. And if you're interested in reading one book, I would recommend Curry's book. It's in paperback, and it's, I think, very intelligent on the issues. And Curry early on poses what I think is an excellent question. He says, if we know as much about crime as I think we do, why haven't we acted more consistently and more constructively to prevent that crime instead of building prisons, is what he means. And I think this is the essential question that we have to ask ourselves. And I would like to discuss this topic with you in the remainder of my talk. As I mentioned at the beginning, I think what we need to do is struggle somehow in order to reconceptualize what the criminal justice system is about. Some of you may have read, may remember from some other classes or other readings, that for hundreds and hundreds of years, everybody was quite sure that the Earth was at the center of the universe. And people would plot diagrams showing the other planets revolving around the Earth. And then technology began to accumulate. Telescopes became available and other means for measuring planetary motion. And as people perform these measurements, none of the data, none of the observations fit into the theory with the Earth at the center. I've seen many of those diagrams, and they're actually almost funny. People draw the diagrams with the Earth in the middle, and they have these orbits that are triangular or crossing each other, just things that clearly don't make any sense, but they absolutely could not figure out what to do with the facts which didn't match the theory. Well, as you probably remember, in the middle of the 1500s, Copernicus came along, and he said, you got it all wrong. If you put the sun at the center of the universe, everything works out fine. And he drew the picture, and he showed how all the data made sense with this new reconceptualization, with this new theory. Of course, he was excommunicated and died as a result of the punishments he experienced as a result of this theory. But now, at least, we believe, and I think correctly so, apparently, that the sun is at the center of the universe. And many of the facts and observations we gather make sense now in light of that perspective. In 1970, there was a similar phenomenon, much less dramatic, but I'm a health researcher and I was involved a bit in the situation. People were looking at the healthcare system, and lots of people were challenging it and saying, look, this doesn't make any sense. The whole thing is irrational. It doesn't make people well. You can't figure out how to get through it. It's enormously expensive. They went on, and a lot of radical critiques of the healthcare system said it's irrational, it's not really a system. And then this organization called the Health Policy Advisory Council wrote a paper and then a book, and they said, no, you got it all wrong. It is a system, and it's a rational system. The only problem is it's not a system to provide health care. It's a system to generate riches and wealth for the people involved in the system, for the people who work for the system. And so that was another example, I think, of there being a set of data and a theory, the two things not matching, but then when the theory was reconceptualized or reestablished, all the data fell into place. At least that was my perception, and I think the perception of many other people. And what I would like to do is just try in the remaining few minutes of my talk to try to build that reconceptualization with you. Dostoevsky, who you all have heard of, I'm sure, he said that if you want to judge a society, you should look into its prisons, that prisons are a reflection of society. We spent some time looking in prisons. Let's just briefly look at some of the statistics about society from the point of view of black-white differentials, which is relevant, I think, to what I'm trying to do here. I've gathered these data. They're all pretty recent, but whenever they're not very recent, the more recent data will be worse. 10% of white people live below the poverty line, compared with 25% of Latino people and 32% of black people. Black median family income is about half of white median family income. The median net worth is $40,000 for a white family and $3,000 for a black family, so that white families therefore own on the average 13 times as much as black families. And a government study predicts that by the year 2000, 70% of black men will be unemployed. The black infant mortality rate is twice as high as the white rate. The black maternal mortality rate is 3 times the white rate. White people live on the average about 6 years longer than black people. The average black man will not even live long enough to collect his Social Security. And a recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine, our most prestigious journal, has found that the life expectancy of a black man in Harlem is less than that of a man in Bangladesh. 4%, these are all about education, 4% of doctoral candidates are black, 4% of college faculty are black. Again, black people are perhaps 13% of the population. 7% of medical students are black, and this percent has been decreasing since 1972. 2% of physicians are black, 2% of medical school faculty are black, 2% of dentists are black. 5% of law school students are black, 2% of law school faculty are black, 1% of lawyers are black. All of these figures, by the way, include all of the black colleges in the United States. If they get omitted, the figures become far more odious and dramatic. Now, I would like to maintain to you that when you assemble the conditions of life that I've presented you with, the rates of imprisonment that I've shown you earlier, and many other phenomena that we're all aware of in society, that these conditions together all amount to genocide. And I would suggest to you that the United States is committing genocide against black people. Now, I know that this is a very emotional word. I know that, it brings on strong responses to all of us. And it is not really essential to me that you agree, as long as you understand the true awfulness of the situation. However, I do believe that what I've shown you is consistent with the United Nations definition of genocide. The General Assembly of the United Nations, 30 years ago, said genocide consists of one or more of the following: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting upon the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, again, I believe that this is a process of genocide that's going on. These were some people who actually I was demonstrating with at Pontiac Prison in central Illinois. You can see the prison there in the background. They were maintaining this. Not too long ago, I don't know, 2-3 months ago, there was a series of shows on the same night on ABC with Ted Koppel about the black so-called underclass, and lots of black people were on the show saying, yep, it's genocide. Ted didn't agree, but that's another topic for another time. Now, when a people are confronted with this situation, with these kinds of conditions, with this kind of attack or oppression, we might call it, being human means you're going to resist these conditions. No group of human beings will tolerate them without resistance. And indeed, I think the history of the United States in many ways can be characterized by the history of black people fighting against racism in the United States and also in pursuit of their own freedom. And this struggle, I think, has been a long-standing one. There's this book by Vincent Harding called There Is a River, and he documents the struggle, which he says flows through the history of the United States. It's another wonderful book in paperback if you'd like to read it. But I think when black people have struggled, it's not only been against racism, but it's been in favor of their freedom. It's been an effort to create a new way of life. I just have some slides of some of these moments just to show you. This is one of Dr. King's marches in Selma, Harriet Tubman leading the slaves out of the South. These are prisoners rebelling at Attica in 1971. People protesting the racist murder at Howard Beach a couple of years ago. And of course, Malcolm X. Now, it's at this stage, I think, that I would like to begin to propose my reconceptualization to you. For those of us who were around, and looking at you, I think there were very few of us who were, but during the 60s, and you've heard about the 60s, right? Everybody's heard about that. During the 60s and 70s, and even the late 50s, the struggle of black people literally shook this country to its foundation. And it did more than just shake this country, because many people who were involved in national liberation struggles in Africa have written how they were inspired by the black struggle here in the United States. Many African leaders are always quoting Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. That's a common phenomenon. And the United States then, and I have lots of reports done by government agencies, were consciously saying, look, this is getting out of control. If we don't stop it, we're going to really be in trouble. And many programs throughout the United States were instituted to try to deal with this situation. One was the invention of the criminal justice system. I mean, all of its elements and components existed, but it actually was invented in 1965, and it was then that you had the initial departments of criminal justice sprung up, that for the first time. What I would suggest to you today is that the true purpose of prisons has nothing at all to do with crime. That is not to say that, of course, there aren't criminals in prison, but it is to say that the prison system today has as its true purpose the containment of black people and other people of color as well. And that's what it is about. Now, when I put forward a hypothesis like this or a theory, like all theories, it's meant to summarize the data and to be tested by the data. So I think, although this might be an unusual theory to most of you, what I would urge you to do is put it up against the data. On the one hand, you have a model and a theory that we're told about every day by every organ in society, that prisons are about crime. And yet, hundreds of facts, some of which I've shown you today and many, many more which exist, all say they're not. And so I'm giving you an alternative theory now to consider what the purpose of prisons is. And I would urge you to think about it and consider it. If I provoke some thought, then that's really good. There's one last thought I would like to leave you with. As was mentioned at the beginning, you know, I've tried to work in issues surrounding prisons and racism for several years. And I've come to believe that as conditions worsen every day in this country in general, and for black people, of course, in particular, that the role of white people, of us white people, has to really be examined. More and more, I believe that any middle ground that may have ever existed is eroded. And we now have to take a stance. We could declare ourselves to be on the side of black people in their pursuit of their freedom, which I believe in the end is our freedom as well. We could try to learn and understand from their struggles and generate struggles ourselves. Or we could be on the side of the racist criminal justice system. Some pictures of that criminal justice system. We can be on the side of black people in their fight for freedom, or we can be on the side, I don't know if you can see this very well, of this is a white man who's holding a sign congratulating Bernie Goetz, the guy in New York who shot the 4 black teenagers on the train. Here's a woman signing a petition to bring back the death penalty. We can be on her side, or we can be on the side of the pursuit of freedom in this country. So I would like to stop now. I would like to thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it, especially through the difficult beginning period. And if you would like to talk, if you have any questions or any comments you'd like to make, I'd love to hear it. And if those of you would like to stay later on and see the video or videos we have, then that would be great. Thank you.
Raise your hand, and I guess Steve can call on you. We can have some
Also, don't be polite. I mean, yes.
I would like to urge you to think about altering your presentation. One point is you made some comments on the history of science. I think Copernicus died as an old man. His theory, at first blush, did not improve the fitting of the data at all. The epicyclical stuff of Ptolemy was actually very good. Why don't you get a history of science book and look up that chapter, and maybe you'll have to alter your talk. I would suggest also that you talk to your doctor friends and ask about the quality of the New England Journal of Medicine. Have you ever noticed that you never see any news stories from any other journals of medicine? It turns out that they have a special editorial policy which doesn't make them the National Enquirer of medical journals, but their policy is to get those kinds of articles that get in the news. And I think you should be a little cautious about endorsing them so emphatically.
Yes.
You've stated all these bad things that the prisons are doing. Do you have any like alternatives? It seems like you started out. When I came to this presentation, I was under the assumption that you were going to talk about what is wrong with the prison system, and you've gone to like discrimination against blacks. You know, do you have any? What do you suppose like a resolution to this situation would be?
Well, I agree with that quote, I don't know if you hear at the time, by Nagel, which said that the causes of crime in this society are rooted in the nature of society, in the social inequities. And I think until we generate a society that is based on fairness and not inequality, that is based on, say, the needs of people instead of the needs of a few people to get rich, that crime will persist and the use of prisons will continue. I don't have any great solutions. I don't know what you do in the middle, of the situation that's crazy. I don't know how we get out of it except to fight for a fair society. I wasn't trying to talk about discrimination. I was trying to show why the prison system, A, is not about crime, and B, how it doesn't help anything that I can think of. Yeah.
Steve, I have a couple things I just want to add. I agree with your presentation, but you're talking about the true purpose of the prison system, and I think you have it right. The repression of redundant populations, particularly blacks and Hispanics, minorities. But on top of that also, ask yourself this question. Why, for example, in Europe, where a European political system, they may have 8 or 10 political parties, while in the United States, we only have 2 parties, the Republicans or Democrats. Why is that? And I suggest to you that we also use prison systems to lock up white politicals. And I think it's about time we say that. You know, Eugene Debs' friend, the Socialist Party, labor leaders. The federal prison system is full of socialists, full of labor leaders, full of cultural people from the 60s. The whole drug war is really a war against our generation. It's a political war, it's not a drug war. On top of that, something else I just want to suggest. If you think back historically, you think about Cervantes, Victor Hugo, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn. You think back about a lot of famous literary people, art people, Van Gogh, for example. They were all convicts. They were locked up. Every political system has used prisons to lock up painters and artists and poets and politicians that they found to be somehow threatening the system. And we're doing it today in America. So it's not just holding down and containing minority populations. It's holding down and containing a lot of political dissent. I'm a former federal prisoner. When I was in federal prison, the prisons were full of labor leaders. You wonder why there's no unions left? Because the leadership is in prison.
Thank you, I appreciate that, yeah.
Are you basing your data on blacks that would go to prison on whites and blacks prosecuted for the same crime?
Well, no. I mean, this is data that's taken from government publications. There was no comparison in any of this about people prosecuted for the same crimes.